All right, now for something completely different, something that I hope is going to be a little bit less depressing in the here and now, but possibly controversial, so I'm going to try and avoid stepping on any third rails.
Oh, Lord.
I will avoid it. Do not worry, gentlemen. I'm going to be very reasonable with all this. And I'm going to be talking about the Dr. Evil theory of history, its proponents, and the historians who are the proponents and their attempts to gatekeep new historians who are trying to put forward a more contextualized and less black and white, nuanced version of history. Because Daryl Cooper, otherwise known as Martyrmade, is going to be making an appearance on the Joe Rogan podcast very, very soon, which I'm very interested to watch. I'm sensing that Twitter, after it, will be full of clips of him saying things that are intentionally provocative, that might sound a bit mad to some people, because he's obviously doing it on purpose for to get some
notoriety.
Yeah, to get some notoriety. But I think what we're seeing at the moment, outside of the controversy that will be generated by this, because of course there was the controversy when he did a Tucker Carlson interview at the end of last year, which I'm going to refer back to, is that we are facing a paradigm shift at the moment in the way that people are examining the Second World War. Whereas previously, and you expect this with every great conflict that erupts, each side has a great incentive to portray the other side as the utter barbarians, no nuance, the most evil people who've ever existed. They're Dr. Evil. They're crazy and evil just for the sake of it. We see it even today with the way that in 2022 Putin was portrayed, following the initiation of the Ukraine war. But as time passes, people tend to become more detached from that initial hysteria, from the initial portrayal of that, and they look at things in a more objective and greater context, and they're able to put the pieces in place. Some refer to this as revisionism, some use it like a dirty word, but if you go back to the early 20th century, even 10, 15 years after the end of the First World War, you had people turning around and saying, listen, the Germans were not the most evil people to ever exist. Here's the greater context that started the chain of events that did that. The Second World War's had a bit of a longer lasting legacy than the First World War in that, but we're starting to see people like Daryl Cooper, who are not, as the smears are saying, coming out and acting as apologists for Nazi or Soviet crimes or any crimes that were committed under the Second World War, but who are trying to put it into a broader context and elucidate it for people who've only had the black and white version of the story thus far.
I will say it is pretty black and white to say that Winston Churchill was the greatest villain of the Second World War.
Oh yeah, I disagree with him on that. And that was very clearly him just trying to be naughty and a bit of an edgelord so that he could get some controversy going. But again, I mean, even in the initial Tucker Carlson interview, he stated outright that he was trying to be provocative. And he's done a lot of trolling on Twitter as well. Again, because no publicity, any publicity is good publicity, right? Yeah. May I have this mouse?
Oh, yes, sorry.
But what isn't controversial is Islander magazine, which is a wonderful magazine full of lots of very uncontroversial figures like Carl Benjamin, Dr. Nima Parvini, Morgoth's Review, and many more. Connor Tomlinson, you've never had a controversy, have you, Connor?
Ask, hope, not hate.
No, I don't think so. I think we're all very, very clean.
Weirdly, it's their greatest hits, though, isn't it?
Yes.
We looked at Hope Not Hate State of Hate and thought, right, we need that guy.
Yeah, there you go. And I got my first mention, so get in there, boyos.
It's like a right-wing phone book.
I know.
Yeah, it is. But you can buy that on the website for $14.99. It is a limited run, so you can get them while they're still going. They won't be available forever. We also have the Islander 3 merch line that's now available, like this wonderful winter sports t-shirt. Again, the designs on these are absolutely wonderful, so pick them up while you still can. And for our Redditors in the audience, they now go up to a size that will fit. I don't know how you got onto this video. Perhaps you misclicked somewhere, but, you know, if you're interested...
Grab a t-shirt anyway.
Yeah, grab a t-shirt. I mean, you don't need to say that it was from an evil right-wing podcast. It just looks cool, right? So Joe Rogan himself has actually courted a bit of controversy even prior to Martyrmade showing up on his... making his appearance very, very soon, which was that he had this gentleman appear on his podcast. Now, I've actually referred to this guy, Ian Carroll, before when the whole Diddy controversy was going around, because he was sharing a lot of videos that were actually quite interesting in terms of like the behind the scenes connections that Diddy had and trying to trace everything. I have not watched this episode. I do not know what he said on it, so I cannot support or back up any of the claims.
He's very anti-Israel.
I know that. I know that for a fact. He did get a condemnation from the ADL, though. So we're not particularly surprised about that. And we can be sure that there will probably be another condemnation from the ADL following this. So again, Martyr Made, he's made a recent appearance on Aura McIntyre, who I consider a friend. He's a friend of the show. And he's announced in this that he's quick update, got a wedding to attend this weekend. And from there, I'm going to Austin to do the Joe Rogan experience. Far as I know, this is the first appearance that he will make, and I'm sure it'll be a very, very interesting conversation. And this is presumably in support of the fact that he is doing this new series, because if you've not watched Martyr Made, he's a very, very interesting history podcaster. He's got his Substack where he also writes articles as well. Sometimes he'll turn those into podcasts. He's done a very, very, very long and in-depth series. The first one he did on the Israel-Palestine conflict, tracing it back to the 19th century, the onset of Zionism, and trying very, very hard to look at it straight down the middle and empathize with both sides. It's one of his greatest strengths, to be honest. And it's very, very interesting. I've listened to the first 2 episodes of it thus far. It's very, very comprehensive. He's done a series on things like the Jim Jones massacre. He's done series that I also listened to on the Epstein allegations. Lots of good stuff, but this latest one is he's diving into the Second World War. And he's trying to look at it again from a down-the-middle, empathetic perspective, trying to...
I see why he's come a cropper here.
Yeah, trying to present the Germans not as cartoon Hollywood villains, whether or not you agree with the actions that they took, but trying to examine them as real people who existed in a real time and place with greater context. And you can also take a look at the way that their war aims were interacting with other people's war aims, because I've been doing a lot of research recently into the Second World War myself, and we'll be referring to a little bit of that if we have time as we go on. But the thing that I've come to the conclusion of was that World War II was basically the Americans seeing Europe destroying itself for the second time in a row within 20 years and deciding, fantastic, we'll carve you up with the Russians.
Right, it was a reversal of the Monroe Doctrine. Just before you get taken out of context by ill-motivated actors, yes, of course, we disagree with what the Germans did in World War II.
I hate the fact that you always have to, but I appreciate what you're trying to do there.
I know I'll be called a hall monitor, but...
No, I think that's
fair. For anyone who's wondering, we side with the British.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because we're the British.
Yeah, also because we lost, as I will explain as this goes further. We
side with ourselves.
We were on the side of the people who won. Yeah. But we ourselves lost. There's a reason that we're not a great power in the world anymore. There's a reason that our greatest bragging rights on the world stage is that we were number 2 soft power. And we have no empire anymore. And all of the members of the Commonwealth are flooding into our country in record numbers, and lots of other strangers from foreign lands as well. So, of course, this immediately gets taken and... people take to Twitter because he put out a trailer for it where he just was like, let's look at let's make this look cool.
So I've never watched or listened to any of this stuff.
Nothing that you wouldn't see on the History Channel.
Yeah, but just, he's saying he's an open Holocaust denier. Is he a Holocaust denier?
No.
Right.
No. As you can imagine, for a man who did a 30-hour series on the 19th century to 1947, Israel and Palestine, he covered a lot of stuff in the Second World War in that series, including the pogroms and the Holocaust itself. He had an enormous half-an-hour segment in one on the, I think he did it on the Ukrainian massacre of, I think it was 30 to 50,000 Jews in Babi Yar, where they were just lined up against a massive pit and shot. Yeah. So what that is, and we're all familiar with this, is them taking a very small clip from his interview with Tucker and taking it completely out of context. Now, what he said in the clip is that the Germans initiated a new front of the war, the Second Front, with the Russians, expecting it to be a short war, not expecting to have to deal with winter conditions, took on far more prisoners of war than they expected that they would have to, and had no infrastructure and no food to give them, which led to ridiculous levels of deaths in the prisoner of war camps. This is all true and can in fact be verified by books like this. Stalin's War by Sean McMeekin, an expert on the Russian side of the early 20th
The
century.
Holocaust denier, perhaps?
Published by Penguin. So
As most Holocaust denial is.
Came out in 2023, I believe. And people are saying, well, he was just diminishing the Holocaust. He didn't mention anything to do with the extermination camps, which were all in Poland. There was actually dozens of prisoner of war camps dotted all across the Eastern Front, which I don't think people know, but the Baltics on the north, all the way to the bottom of the Balkans, it's actually a massive, massive front to do a lot of fighting. Again, there were plenty of prisoner of war camps. This is true. In this, Sean McMeekin discusses how I think the camp death rate for the prisoner of war camps, without talking about the extermination camps like Sobibor, Treblinka, Auschwitz, Majdanek, was 57.5%. Now, when discussing this, Daryl Cooper said, obviously that's a crime. That's a crime. They did not prepare properly for it, but they should have known that if you're going against Russia, you're going to have to deal with these kinds of contingencies, and it's still something that they are guilty of. Millions of people died in these camps.
I mean, it's one of those things. I remember years ago, I'm not a Second World War scholar, but I remember watching like a documentary or something where they were saying that, like, you know, in Ukraine, like lone German officers would go to Ukrainian villages and stuff and just have prisoners of war, like at a big trail, just willingly walking behind them. Because, of course, they were thinking, oh, great, the Germans are here to liberate us from the Soviets, right? And so they would end up with, like, tens of thousands of people that, like you said, they're not prepared for. And it's like, yeah, okay, it's irresponsible and it was bad. Like,
yeah, I mean, and again, Daryl Cooper is not supporting the actions of the Germans in saying that, nor is he denying the Holocaust. It's just a smear. It's just a completely out of context smear. One of the other interesting things about this is, though, because of how much the Soviet subjects hated the Soviet government, despite all of that, 1.5 million Soviet subjects, including 800,000 ethnic Russians, still defected, which is very, very interesting. But one of the other things that came out was that recently, the other day, Neil Ferguson, who was part of the original controversy, decided to jump in on this and call him a nasty little Nazi apologist who's won an audience of millions. That is apparently what happens when podcasts drive out books and anti-history drives out history. And this seems to be something that he's trying to coin, this idea of anti-history. Right. What is the definition of anti-history versus history? Well, I'll show you in a few minutes when we get to the article that he wrote. Konstantin also came out in an argument with Dave Smith, which was quite funny. I really like Dave Smith. Konstantin's not my biggest fan, but he also took a very dishonest tack with this, where he said that in the interview with Tucker, he said Churchill was the chief villain of World War II, not Hitler. Again, I disagree with that statement.
So Konstantin is correct.
He did say that, but then he goes on and then also said that being genuinely right-wing has been made illegal in Europe when the only political parties banned in Europe are Nazis. Interesting. Now, Konstantin, you know you're being disingenuous when you say that, because Nazi is a term that has been applied to basically everybody who is remotely right-wing at this point. And in Germany right now, back in 2021, the government decided that they could spy on the AfD and recently tried to hold a vote to ban them for being too right-wing.
There were 116 lawmakers from other parties that tried to create what they call a firewall around the AfD, and according to the anti-Nazi clauses of the Constitution, tried to ban them. Now, if you're looking for a candidate for the reincarnation of Adolf Hitler, a lesbian who believes in free markets, whose girlfriend is a Sri Lankan immigrant, is probably not the best one to pick.
The AfD is just a patriotic liberal party.
Yep. They are a populist party, which in Europe is sometimes used as a synonym for Nazi, as anything remotely populist and right-wing is. So I think that's a very, very dishonest framing of the argument right there, and Konstantin should know better.
But I just think, him trolling with the picture of Hitler in Paris, saying it'd be better than the drag queens and stuff like this. Yeah, that's not... obviously,
that's not good.
That's just a troll again.
Sure, I appreciate.
Yeah, but the troll muddies the waters. Like,
exactly.
To stay clear, it's not a good idea.
Yeah, but there is a big difference between the output that he puts on Twitter versus the stuff that he puts on his podcast.
He's responsible for both.
Exactly. Exactly. So it's I don't think he's a Holocaust denier, but he's definitely not helping his case here.
No, No, of course not. And he does some trolling on his Instagram as well, which people liked to get hold of. But this next part is where he says, then he refused to debate Andrew Roberts, a Churchill historian and biographer, because Daryl lifted all of his arguments from David Irving, whose Nazi apologia has been discredited for decades, and Daryl can't actually defend Irving's arguments himself. He can only regurgitate them on podcasts where no one challenges him. Again, straight away, one of the big arguments that people were taking out of context is from this recent book published by Penguin. Many of his other arguments can be found in other books like this one, The New Dealer's War, published by Basic Books, who amongst others publish Thomas Sowell, and other centre-right thinkers and historians. And this guy, Thomas Fleming, has appeared on CNN and PBS. He's a very, very safe historian. And the interesting thing about using the Irving accusation is that Daryl did post a load of the books that he'd been reading to research this, and yet Irving was included in that. But you know who does also cite David Irving in their books on history? So you've got Max Hastings.
It's not Neil Ferguson, is it?
I wanted to try and look through a few of his bibliographies, but I couldn't. I didn't have any of his books on World War II. Maybe, though. So Max Hastings... Ian Kershaw cites him a lot in his Hitler biography, which is a massive 2-volume set. And also Andrew Roberts.
Right. Why do they cite them?
Well, they're included in the bibliography, and I would assume that they're citing him because of the fact that he did a lot of the primary archival research.
But I don't know if you know. Are they challenging him in his assertions? Well, or are they just citing him and saying David
Andrew Roberts is a just normal biography of Churchill. I don't believe he's actually responding to other historians' arguments within the actual biography.
Right, so we don't. But in the context,
Max Hastings, for instance, he cites him in Bomber Command, which is talking about the Bomber Command during the Second World War, and just cites a lot of Destruction of Dresden, which was his initial book where it came out.
The issue that they have is that if Irving is the primary researcher for a particular topic, well, you've got nowhere else to go to if he's the guy who went through all the archives, read them all, documented it.
Well, I mean, Destruction of Dresden was written in collaboration with Bomber Harris in the 1960s. So he did a lot of this. But what I dislike is the gatekeeping aspect of this. Yeah. Obviously, Irving said some out there stuff which people vehemently disagree with. The Deborah Lipstadt Irving trial went terribly for him, and his name has been in the mud ever since then. But apparently, there's a gatekeeping aspect to who's allowed to cite his work or not. And Daryl, and we've not really got to the part of his series yet where he addresses any arguments that Irving may or may not have been making, is being smeared through association. He's been tarred through association, whereas again, the arguments that he actually made on Tucker Carlson can be verified and found in books like this, and plenty of other mainstream books, including Andrew Roberts' book himself. So I just found that a little bit disingenuous.
It does depend on the context as to whether, because I haven't read Robert's book on Churchill, it depends on the context as to whether or not he's stating him as saying, here's where I lifted this fact about Churchill from, versus this is what David Irving says, and is that incorrect? Like, we don't actually know why he cited him. That's my only, that people will trip you up on, basically.
That's fair, but having read a bit of Andrew Roberts' biography, it's not a biography in which he seems to be trying to address other people's arguments. It's just, here is Churchill's life, and Irving did his biographies on the war part of Churchill's life during the Second World War. So for many people, because he did a lot of primary research, they are useful resources still, whether or not you want to come to the same conclusions as him. Again, the Tucker Carlson interview was the thing that made all of this blow up all the way back in September, I believe it was. And one of the first things that happened was, out of nowhere, you get all the worst people in the world spring into action to get a load of people like Neil Ferguson, like Andrew Roberts, to immediately begin telling them how naughty he's being in what I can only describe as Soviet-style denunciations. Like, you had Andrew Roberts appearing on Fraser Nelson, our best friend, Fraser Nelson. You had him appearing on Piers Morgan as well. And then Andrew Roberts himself wrote this article here saying that no, Churchill was not the villain. Again, I actually agree with this. I do not agree with his statement that Churchill was the villain. Again, reading these two books here, when you get to issues like the Tehran Conference, I can't help but feel bad for Churchill because he was completely sidelined by Roosevelt and Stalin, who immediately began plotting together on how they were going to dismantle the British Empire and carve up Europe for themselves in spheres of influence once the war was over. So I can't see Churchill as the bad guy in that, especially because, honestly, when it came to things like covering up the Katyn massacre, which was an atrocity committed by the Soviets once they'd partitioned eastern Poland alongside the
Polish officers.
Yeah, the 10,000 Polish officers who had been shot. So the Germans notified the Red Cross that they'd found these corpses. Then the Polish government in exile in London said that they wanted an inquiry to find out who did it. Everybody knew that it was the Soviets. The Soviets said, no, it was the Germans. Who cares that all of these corpses are way too old for it to have been the Germans to do this? Churchill was the one guy who was actually saying, no, we need to put this inquiry in and we need to find out what's going on, because he understandably was a bit uncomfortable about potentially being aligned with people who just brutally massacre for no reason. It was the Americans who shut it down, the Americans in collaboration with the Soviets. So for all his faults, there are a number of times where Churchill was acting as the most moral person in the conflict.
So when this all kicked off, I wrote a piece for Courage that basically said, yes, Britain, quote unquote, lost World War II in as far as it's entangled in international legal agreements that impair our ability to deport foreign rapists. But Churchill would not have wanted that, and that's why he designed it that way. And I found it interesting that the likes of Oren McIntyre, mutual friend, but also Konstantin Kisin agreed with that. And I think that's why Daryl Cooper has elicited such a bad reaction. It's not just the moral taboo around World War II, it is the stating that Churchill is the key villain, and Churchill's actions have led to Britain being what it is now, when if you transported him through time, the same people that call us Nazis would also call him a Nazi.
Yeah. I just look at it, I just don't think Churchill was in control of what was happening. That's the thing.
Oh no, I've got plenty of references for that. Sadly, and again,
so he can't be the primary villain because he's not the primary agent of anything that's happening.
Well, just in raw bodies as well. It's Stalin.
Yeah. Well, yeah, but obviously, but like it just feels that things were happening around that he was trying to hold back the tide of history essentially, and he couldn't do it, obviously.
Again, so when I'll just go through some examples of that, and then we can move on. So the Tehran Conference. So they get there. The first thing that happens is Stalin gives this cover story that, oh, we're about to be assassinated, so you're all going to have to stay at my compound instead. Doesn't extend that to Churchill, who apparently, if there was an assassination plot, he doesn't care if he gets shot. The Iranian government said there's nothing like that. He just wanted to get Roosevelt in the same compound as him so he could bug his rooms and listen into everything that they were saying. Goes to have a meeting with Roosevelt without Churchill being involved, and immediately starts to plot how they can... Well, no, it's not Stalin that does this. Roosevelt offers to him the opportunity, and I've got it here. Let me see, I posted this the other day, just saying that, why don't we carve up India together? I know Britain owns India right now. They're in charge of India.
Take it, please.
Yeah, he says, explaining that he thought that it was better to not discuss the question of India with Mr. Churchill, Roosevelt proposed that the United States and USSR work together to reform British India from the bottom, somewhat on the Soviet line.
Incredible how the American president can be so pro-Soviet.
Well, yes, it is incredible until you realise that people like Harry Hopkins, who was one of his right-hand man who spent a lot of time in Russia, was actively trying to purge the Roosevelt administration of anti-Soviet elements that was determined entirely by him, whether you were anti-Soviet or not. So that's from Stalin's war. In the New Dealers' war, it actually goes a bit further than that, because he mentions that, and then he also says that they were basically planning on carving up French Indochina as well, and wanted to make sure that France was not an independent country afterwards. Again, it seems to me that in the conflict, America saw an opportunity with Europe tearing itself apart and said, we can become the global superpower with Europe and particularly the British Empire out of the way. That's why with Lend-Lease we got, 50 rundown war destroyers from the First World War.
That we had to pay back.
And Russia, happily, managed to get a Lend-Lease, but all brand new stuff. We sent them stuff in Britain and got it for free. Well, they got, they got a $1 billion credit line. And then they used up that $1 billion credit line, and then Roosevelt said, here's another $1 billion for free, don't worry about it, pay us back whenever you want.
So clearly, the place that Churchill occupies in Daryl Cooper's mind is fulfilled by Roosevelt.
Certainly from the British perspective.
Yeah, so he's just got the wrong man.
Yeah. I mean, I believe...
You can feel just how outmaneuvered Churchill is in all of this, right? Like, he obviously, if it was up to Churchill, none of these decisions were being made. But obviously, Churchill is not responsible for any of these. And he's been completely sidelined and gone around.
Yeah, so, I mean, Roosevelt in particular seems to have been ridiculously friendly to the Soviet administration. Thomas Fleming says here, in FDR's political cosmology, Russia was exempted from the negative judgments of the old world, which the New World was morally superior to, yeah. Like the United States, she wasn't part of Europe. Ever since his recognition of the Soviet Union in 1933, he'd envisioned a Russian-American entente as the answer to the fratricidal tendencies of Europe's great powers. Furthermore, Cordell Hull, who was the Secretary of State underneath Roosevelt, gave a speech to the Congress in 1943, right before Tehran, characterizing the communists as being like your country cousins. Come to town. They're a little slow, but well worthwhile. He saw no barriers whatsoever to future Soviet-American cooperation. So
They killed millions of people.
They'd already killed millions of people.
Holodomor had already happened.
Yeah, 10 years prior to that, and they knew. The Katyn massacre had already happened, and they knew. And to give another example of Churchill actually being the most moral person in the room. So on the second to last night of the conference, Stalin was hosting a dinner and started joking about how following the end of the war, they would just indiscriminately shoot 50,000 or 100,000 members of the German army, of their officer class. Churchill, it says, exploded and cried that the British people had always been opposed to and always would be opposed to mass vengeance. Stalin insisted that at least 50,000 needed to be shot. Churchill then said, I would rather be taken out into the garden here and now and be shot myself than sully my own and my country's honour by such infamy. Prime Minister was obviously aware that he was dealing with the man who had massacred 10,000 Polish officers in the Katyn forest. Roosevelt's reaction alarmed Churchill even more. The president suggested a compromise. Shoot 49,000 instead.
I mean, FDR really was just a commie, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Really
well, I'm with Curtis Yarvin on this.
Yeah, really was just
it's a great argument that's made in, again, Stalin's War, because he goes through some of the earlier parts of FDR's administration with the New Deal, where he points out, well, he has the New Deal, opens up all of these new government departments that immediately get filled with communist infiltrators and spies.
Infiltrators.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. Anyway, again, you can disagree with Daryl Cooper. I think that the historical gatekeeping on certain subjects is unnecessary. I think it's a sign that these people are afraid that their conception of history is being challenged. And I think I can hope that, given some of the examples that I've given today, that you can see that it was not as black and white, given the internal dynamics even within the Allies, that this was not something where America truly believed. I mean, the soldier on the ground probably did, but the higher-ups in the American administration, in the Soviet administration, did not truly believe that they were fighting a war for good, they were fighting a war for power.
You've definitely made Churchill look a lot more sympathetic than he normally
does. I was reading through some of the stuff and going like, oh God, I feel bad for him.
I can totally understand why Churchill reacts this way.
I feel really bad for him. But I'm very interested to see what's going to happen with this Martha Maid interview with Joe Rogan. I imagine over the course of 3 to 4 to 5 hours, they're probably going to get into the subject of that, and perhaps he'll be able to better acquit himself over a longer format where they're going to hone down on it. Either way, I think his series is excellent, and I listened to the first episode, the prologue, this morning. Difficult stuff. Difficult stuff, but not a sympathizer, not apologising for anything that the Nazis did crime-wise.
Islander issue 3 is now available to purchase from shop.lotus.com and is the next step in the story that we are telling with this magazine. For this issue, we have collected piercing and esoteric essays from the finest right-wing minds on the theme of our civilizational winter. Each of our authors is an expert in bringing forth the most important hidden revelations from the lowest reaches of the soul, and it has all been beautifully rendered in a medievalist revivalist aesthetic. For this issue, I commissioned a new translation of the ancient Anglo-Saxon poem, The Wanderer, and have written a companion essay exploring how it is a reflection of our modern experience. I personally feel that this is the most important thing I've ever written, so I will be looking forward to your feedback on it. We have resolved our distribution issues, with the magazines being printed in advance of the orders, so we can guarantee that you will receive your copy very soon after ordering it, and you will also receive emailed updates so you can see exactly where it is. Hopefully, issue 3 can provide you with the space and context to engage in deep reflection about the nature of our circumstances, to discover hidden truths about yourself and find the resolve to make it through our spiritual exile.